my dear colleagues. It's for me a very special occasion spending this afternoon with you to talk about a very important topic: learning disorders, special needs, and teaching foreign languages, in particular English. I am an English teacher. I have been teaching English for the last 30 years in secondary schools, both in Rome and in Turin. At the moment, I am working in a secondary school in Turin, in the city center, a school for technicians. Recently, I was involved in a lot of projects about learning disorders, in particular learning disorders, dyslexia, for example, and learning and teaching English. It's important for me to tell you that I am a mother of a student with a learning disorder, and this gave me the occasion to study, to enrich my life, to improve my life, and also my job. This afternoon, we are going to talk about teaching English and foreign languages to students with special needs, and in particular to students with learning disorders. At the end of this presentation, you can ask me questions, and also I'll give you some contacts at the end of the presentation to contact me freely whenever you want. You will see the email and the website, the Macmillan website, at the end of the presentation, and you can find all the materials about this presentation on the website, on Macmillan website. I'll give you this contact later on. If you are ready, I'm ready too to start our presentation, and I hope to be clear, but please ask me questions at the end, not only for curiosities, not only to improve your knowledge about this topic, but also for your personal information for your job and for your life. It was for me. Okay, let's start with the presentation. The idea of teaching to students with special needs is teaching inclusively. We are going to see some strategies. I give you some suggestions and also some hints. But please ask me for more and more strategies, or if you have good practices, please let me know. I'm very happy to share these with you. The first step is the definitions of learning disorders and who are the students with special needs. We are also going to see the Italian laws and the rules that we should know to face all the problems related to teaching in classes with mixed abilities, with the students with special needs, and with the students in particular with learning disorders. And at the end, we are going to consider some strategies, of course, with a specific focus on teaching English. Of course, the first step is who are students with special educational needs. I'll ask you a lot of questions during this presentation, and I hope to have some answers. So who are these students? My dear colleagues, here we have a long list, but the list could be longer and longer. First of all, students with learning disorders. Immediately after this slide, we are going to consider what are learning disorders. Students with permanent deficits, students with disadvantages, students with temporary disadvantages. I'd like to focus for a couple of minutes about these. Have you in mind what are or what could be the disadvantages, and what do we mean when we speak about temporary disadvantages? Have you in mind some students in your classes with temporary disadvantages? Usually, just to give you some idea about this, a student who is in a period of depression, but a depression could come from the divorce of their parents, for example, his or her parents, for example, or students who are living in a period of poverty, and so on. Students, let's go on with the list. Students with health problems. Also in this case, I suppose you have in mind a lot of examples. Students just arrived from another country. Students coming from another country means, for example, students that at home speak a language, at school speak and use another language, but are asked to learn English. Sometimes this could be a big problem, a big educational challenge. Students suffering from temporary forms of depression. You know that teenager depression is very common. And students with eating disorders. I hope that you have in mind other examples, but considering these students with special educational needs is very important, because all the problems, the ones that I mentioned before, but a lot of the problems of our students should be faced with the particular strategies. According to the slides, the first point of the list is related to students with learning disorders. The most common known disorder is dyslexia. Dyslexia means some difficulties in the learning process. Dyslexia means some problems in attention. Dyslexia means some problems in memory. Learning disorders usually deal with maths, with spelling, with writing, and with learning a new language. I have a quotation in Italian for you. Alcuni ragazzi compensano abbastanza bene il loro disturbo, ma non avendo automatizzato le abilità strumentali di base, lettura e o scrittura e o calcolo, si troveranno a dover mascherare il disturbo utilizzando maggiori risorse attentive rispetto ai coetanei. What do you think about this quotation? Try to think about problems of attention. Focus our attention, on our students' attention. What happens? If we take a look to dyslexia and its main aspects, here I have for you a short list. Listen, I'm going to read it for you. Among the main aspects of dyslexia, we can find problems in learning the letter sounds for reading and spelling, difficulty in reading single words, such as on flashcards and in lists. That is decoding. Lack of fluency, but also reading slowly with many mistakes. Poor spelling, poor visual coding, that is orthographic coding. Think about this list, my dear colleagues, and have you in mind, can you recognize any of these aspects in some of your students? Think about difficulty in reading single words, that is decoding. Can you imagine how difficult could be for our students with dyslexia, the process of decoding? We have strategies. We have a lot of strategies, and we have a lot of inclusive strategies, not only to solve the problem, but also, believe me, to improve our teaching methods. As I have just told you, according to special educational needs, learning disorders are 4: dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, dysorthography. What do you know about these learning disorders? Do you know that all these learning disorders are completely related one with the other? Do you know that usually a student with a learning disorder usually has 2 learning disorders? They, in some way, walk in couple. For example, my son is a dyscalculic student with dysgraphia. We are going to see later what are the problems related to all these learning disorders. The first aspect, the first common aspect is attention. We have just talked about this, but we are going to go to consider it later on. Think about all these disorders and let me know, if you like, if you have in your classes students with these disorders. I told you that a very important critical area is attention, but let's go to consider memory. This list considers all the memories that human beings use. Memoria a lungo termine, semantica. It is related to the use of the language and the vocabulary. Memoria a lungo termine, episodica. It is related to personal events. Memoria procedurale si riferisce alle operazioni necessarie per portare a termine compiti percettivo-motori. It is related to kinesthetic aspects. Memoria prospettica, when we have in mind something that will happen in the future. And now let's consider memory, short-term memory. This is the memory that, together with the working memory, memoria di lavoro, is mainly involved in the learning process. Consider short-term memory. This is the memory that we usually use to go to the end of a task. I quoted an example, telephone numbers. Usually, try to ask yourselves these. How many are the numbers that you usually remember, the telephone number, the numbers that made the telephone number in your life? 3, 4, 5, all the numbers. Well, a person So a student with a learning disorder usually remembers 3 or 4 numbers. Do you think that it is not important during the learning process? Have you ever thought about this? And let's go to the working memory. I quoted this sentence. Serve per mantenere e manipolare le informazioni per eseguire dei compiti. It's what happens during school time. Go to the end of a task and using all the information you have to go to the end of the task. So learning data, learning verbs, learning formula, and so on. Is that important in our school life? Of course, yes. Attention is the first critical area I have just mentioned. A student involved in the learning process, a student with dyslexia, for example, or with a special need involved in the learning process, uses a big amount of attention. And so usually students with learning disorders, for example, are considered lazy, but it's not a lack of attention, it's a problem of attention. Have you ever thought about self-esteem? A student with a lot of failures in his or her life has got a lot of a problem of self-esteem. What we should or we are asked to do? To fight against imagination, try to use all the strategies to make our student not feel different in a negative sense. But we are also asked to promote exchanges and different learning styles. A short quotation coming from the Law 170. The Law 170 was issued in 2010, so about 5 years ago, and the year later, in 2011, the guidelines were issued as well. You can find a lot of important information in this law. It's short, you can read it in less than 10 minutes. Please do it. I'd like only to read for you a short sentence. Le istituzioni scolastiche, tenendo conto delle indicazioni contenute nelle allegate linee guida, provvedono ad attuare i necessari interventi pedagogico-didattici per il successo formativo degli alunni e degli studenti con DSA, attivando percorsi di didattica individualizzata e personalizzata e ricorrendo a strumenti compensativi e misure dispensative. Think about, does it happen in your classes? It's a question for you. The law says that students with learning disorders, with special needs, should be followed according to the lines, the teaching lines defined in a particular and important document. The document is called PDP, Piano Didattico Personalizzato. You can see the link to the website of the Italian Ministry of Education, and there you can find some models of this document. There are a lot of models everywhere on the web, you can meet them, but what is relevant is that writing and filling in the PDP, putting crosses on the lines that we decide to follow for the teaching and the learning process of our students with special needs is not a boring or a bureaucratic task. It's very important. It's the guarantee for our students to have the right to learn, to have the right to learn according to his or her style, to his or her intelligence, and so on. Think about this, my dear colleagues. How many times your colleagues have told you sentences like this, what a boring day, I have to fill in the PDP, Or what a boring task of filling in the PDP. It's not boring, believe me, it's fundamental. And now let's go to strategies. You can read in this slide something about, just some hints about cooperative learning. Maybe you have met cooperative learning during your teaching life. Cooperative learning, in my opinion, is fundamental and is a very good inclusive method because it can help us and our students to exchange learning styles. It helps us to promote cooperation and it gives the occasion to increase the value of everyone's skill or skills. Here are some examples. It's easy for everybody to work in a cooperative way. For example, working in small cooperative groups to act a role play. I hope that you have tried it in your school life, but if you didn't, please try. Working in pairs, it helps to avoid and prevent problems in decodifying. It's very important. It avoids also the problem of frustration and margination. Remember this. I have an example for you. It's the school story of a student of mine, Francesco. Francesco is a student with a learning disorder, dysorthography. During the first weeks of school, Francesco had a test, a grammar test about Saxon genitive. What Francesco did? He considered the owner and the object in a completely, according to the rule, wrong way. So he added the S to the object, the apostrophe and the S. When Francesco gave me his test, I was shocked. There was no sentences with the right order. So I asked Francesco, what happened, Francesco? Can you tell me something about Saxon genitive? Immediately Francesco answered. He knew perfectly the rule about Saxon genitive. This happens. What are your ideas about evaluating Francesco's test? Is everything wrong? The last and the only thing to do is to use the red pencil to give him a bad mark? I don't think so. There are some solutions. Francesco can decide, according to the law, to have only oral tests. So Francesco can explain only orally Saxon genitive, for example. But, and this is very inclusive, Francesco, just like all his classmates, can use his maps. So, what's the conclusion? It's important to evaluate the process instead of the content. I know that this is a teaching challenge, but what do you think about this? What are your experiences according to this idea of evaluating the process instead of the content? I'm going to show you some strategies, a list of strategies that you could use to face problems and questions created in case of classes with mixed abilities and when we have students with special educational needs. Please take a look of all these sentences. I'd like to focus on two of them. Okay. For example, if you can, please don't have tests during the last time of the school day. I think that it's very easy, but how many times it happens that at the end of the school day, from 12 to 1 p.m., students have a test? It's a very big problem, a problem of attention, a problem of concentration, a problem of memory. Do you remember that these are three critical areas for our students with special needs? But in my opinion, there are problems for each student. Let's consider the idea of giving to our students the possibility to use the maps. What do you think about this? Do you consider that when they are using maps, they are cheating? It's a question for you. The use of technologies is, in my opinion, very, very important. I know, my dear colleagues, that interactive whiteboards are not present in all the schools, or sometimes they don't work properly, or we can't use the interactive whiteboard. It's not a problem. Technologies does not mean using necessarily the interactive whiteboard or the projector or other things. What is relevant is to help ourselves with what we have in our classes. Also, colored chalks are strategies that could be used instead of technologies. Also, colored markers can be useful. What do you think about this? And here we have a list of strategies. Do's and don'ts. Take a look. The list is long. I tried to synthesize it, but it could be again longer and longer. Something about this to focus on. Look at one of the do's. For example, using active verbs. It's interesting, isn't it? Why? Because in the learning process, passing from the active to the passive form can be very difficult for a lot of students. The level of communication becomes poor and poorer. Think about this. Or, I wrote, privilegiare attività cooperative. I have just explained this, but please remember, it's very, very inclusive. It's very, very important. Let's take a look to the don'ts. Avoid abbreviations. Why? Because abbreviations means to ask to our students to decodify something that could be very mysterious. It asks a level of attention that usually our students can't have at that moment of the lesson. In particular, students with learning disorders. In particular, students with dyslexia or the other learning disorders. And what do you think about the last point I wrote? Evitare sovraccarico di compiti e verifiche. I'd like to go to the end of our presentation because I think that it could be in some way something that summarizes what I have told you during this presentation. What does it mean? It means working in a cooperative way with our colleagues. It means planning our lessons. It means giving our students the possibility to be involved in a good learning environment. Sometimes it needs only to be careful to what other colleagues do. Look at our registers. How many times we have a lot of tests during the same day, but it's difficult for our students. It doesn't matter if it's a student with a special need or not. What do you think about this? And last but not least, believe in what we just know. Our experience, our personal experiences, our energies are the most important tools in our hands. My idea is that everybody of us has got in his or her hands the solutions to face problems that can become real resources. The idea, and it's time for your questions, is to change obstacles into resources. Now it's time for your questions. You can download all the presentation and you can see again the video of this webinar in some days on Macmillan on the website www.mondadorieducation.it. Well, I hope to have your questions. I'm here, and please ask me. How can teachers ensure that the PDP is actually implemented? This is a good question. According to the guidelines issued in 2011, the PDP should be implemented at the beginning of each school year. So please be sure that it happens. You should do this during the first Consiglio di classe, usually not later than the end of October. The law asks us to do this before the 31st of October. So be sure that it happens. It is a guarantee for our students, but also for us, teachers. Can you give us a few practical examples on how to have students using maps in such a way that is not unfair to other students or not making tests too easy? Thanks to your question, my dear colleague. I try to be short. It's a very important question. Using maps. Using maps does not mean simplifying or making it easy. It's a very good skill, being able to write, to create, to build maps. And this gives us the possibility to consider maps instead of something that makes the lesson or the learning process easier. It is a guarantee that the learning process is something more complex, but individual, personal. The map is built according to my learning style, according to my intelligence, according to my learning and learning process. So it means the contrary, it's not simplifying. And on the other side, this means teaching in an inclusive way, because imagine the situation. If students are used to use maps, they can share them, and sharing and exchanging tools, documents, maps means have a good learning environment. My students with dyslexia ask me for extra time, but it is very difficult to plan a lesson with different needs according to time. This is a very difficult task, but the solution is easier than you think. The first thing to do is planning the lesson. Planning the lesson means having extra time for everybody. Think about how many times in our school life as teachers, we plan our lessons. Sometimes it's only a question of routines. Planning means also putting during our lessons extra time. It's easy, it's not difficult. It can become a routine. How can I teach learning verbs in a class with students with special needs? This is a very important question. If you remember, in my presentation, I talked to you about the question of using short-term memory. that is learning by heart. It's very difficult for students, not only for students with special needs, but for all our students. The solution is easy also in this case. What do you think about letting your students use the list of irregular verbs instead of asking them to learn them by heart? It's a challenge. In the school where I teach, there are 10 English teachers. I am the only one to do this. But believe me, my students get good marks, and at the end, they remember the verbs better than students that should do this, only learning them by heart. Have we got time for other questions? Okay. I cannot use the interactive whiteboard. Can I teach inclusively without technologies? Of course, yes. I told you that technologies and using technologies means, of course, being able to use the interactive whiteboard and also using other tools, but this is not necessary. Well, it's a challenge because please learn to use interactive whiteboard. Why not? It's very amusing, believe me. The lessons become more and more interesting. But if in your school there isn't an interactive whiteboard, if it doesn't work properly, or if you can't use it, don't use it. And use, as I have just told you, colored chalks, colored markers. Try to be or to become creative, for example, and give you time to learn how to use interactive whiteboard. My dear colleagues, we are at the end of our webinar, and if you like, you can contact me using the following email address: italy.info@macmillan.com. If I have questions, I'll answer you as soon as possible. Thank you for your attention, thank you for your participation, and have a good afternoon. Bye.